This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight our frequent visitor here and fellow, I guess, orator, Mr. Buck Melton, Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome. Well, Buck, we've had lots of conversations about lots of things, and tonight maybe we could just start off our conversation by making reference to Thomas Ricks' book called The Generals. I just have it in front of us here. And basically, Mr. Ricks, Dr. Ricks, wrote his epistle about the way the American generals are put in power. And his idea was that traditionally, going back to the time of General Marshall, if you were a bad guy, they just took you out of there right away. You had your trial in combat and you were fired, and literally hundreds of officers were removed just with any error, any mistake, they're out of there. And then the system has changed substantially, so it's kind of an organization type of arrangement, and that generals are not removed, and that playing safe is the way to become a general. And there's a certain kind of personality that acquires that rank, and it's not suitable for war conditions often. Yes. I guess that's the thrust of what he said. And we could talk about a lot of different subjects. I know you've written about military issues before, have you not?
Yes, I have. And the more I write about it, the less I understand it. But
yes, but it's complicated.
That with several things.
Well, we can get into a little bit about just the way the military works. The idea that you surrender a substantial part of your liberty and freedom to the chain of command, and a person in that chain of command reposes great confidence. The chain of command has been effectively put there, and indeed, the chain of command has control of his life. If you're a soldier, a sailor, a marine, airman, and you're told to, I don't know, take a mission that's a very dangerous mission, you have to do it. You have to go up the hill. You have to take that bunker, and it's your job to do it, and your commander tells you to do it, then it's your obligation to do that. And the assumption is that the system has put in charge of you very meritorious people that are really above reproach, their judgment is. And if the system is opaque and doesn't work, I think we need some discussion about that. Any comments?
Several comments. That yes, when you were talking about prior to George Marshall, prior to roughly World War II, if you made a mistake, you were out. For anybody who knows anything about American military history, I think they'll immediately be drawn by that comment to Abraham Lincoln and the commanders of the Army of the Potomac, because he could not find anybody.
Everyone was fired.
Beat Lee. Yes. It was a much more personal thing. I think the first statement is that we are not really a militaristic people, regardless of what George Patton said.
Yes.
That except in actual wars, and large wars at that, we've always had a very small military establishment down until around World War II.
Yes.
And this very large military that we've had since then really is anomalous. It does not fit into the American system. And when you do get a big military, it does become institutionalized. There becomes a lot of inertia, the rules become more important, and it's less about personalities. Douglas MacArthur, I think, was the last holdover from the old military.
Yes.
And he hung on a good long time. He was really a relic of the past by the time he was fired by Truman in the 1950s.
He was a very complicated person, wasn't he?
Yes.
Very complicated. And sort of one of the comments about we could make is that just the military is a very important part of our culture. It does these great things. It defends us. It's really vanquished terrible enemies in the past. It's a very noble part of our character, and we want it to be successful and work. I guess the interface between civilian control and the military. Their roles there's a very bright line there. Just to throw this comment out, maybe MacArthur was crossing the line.
And no maybe about it. Yeah.
And so that really disturbs the system. If there's a political general, and I think in the Civil War, some of those generals might have had a political tinge attached to them.
Yes.
I mean, thinking about.
Well, George McClellan, who was the first major commander of the Army of Potomac, and he really he was a legend in his own mind.
Yes.
And he did a good job of training that army, but he had a lot of weaknesses. And Lincoln, whom he freely called an ape, a baboon, an idiot, Lincoln once came to call on McClellan, which that's a flag right there.
Yes. As witnessed by Wake Island, we could talk about
exactly. So Lincoln called on McClellan, and McClellan kept him waiting for 2 hours.
Yes.
And Lincoln, being the consummate politician that he was, put up with it.
Yes.
Up until the point that McClellan obviously showed that he was really incapable of winning this war.
Yes.
And then a few years later, McClellan ran against Lincoln for the presidency. Was the Democratic nominee in 1864.
Right. So one of the issues I think that's an important one is that it would be somewhat unusual. I mean, Dwight D. Eisenhower might be an exception, and we've had Zachary Taylor. I guess people have gone into the presidency, and but in general, a person that's pursued a military career. It's not, and there have been people that have, you can, I think, name people that have been vice presidential candidates. I mean, they occasionally get in there, third parties or people that sometimes try and do that, but it's a very difficult journey. And then the idea is the politics and the politicians are kept separate than the military, which it seems to be in many ways quite a commendable situation.
Very much so. We take that absolutely for granted in this country. But
now, but does this might cause a problem? I mean, if the difficulties the country faces now, we have a very complicated situation. We're fighting the Islamic State, I guess. We have people that are blowing up the World Trade Center. We have different ways that we're using our national power. We're using the military to fight these wars. But they're not really classical wars, are they? I mean, the idea of the military is not the kind of war that the military system easily can adjust to. I mean, that they adjust to fighting another system just like theirs.
Yes.
That makes sense to them, doesn't it? If
well,
you want my tank against your tank.
Yes. Well, a bigger system is always slower to change. But Vietnam was a very interesting war, and we learned a lot of lessons there. And our senior generals now either were very junior officers then, or they studied under and learned under officers who were there. And I suppose we're past Colin Powell's time.
Yes.
But for instance, Powell learned his lessons in Vietnam. But things have changed even since Vietnam.
Yes.
We are very much into asymmetric warfare now. We're into putting out brush fires. We are into using the military as peacekeeping forces as opposed to warfighting forces. And once again, a big institution changes slowly, and we've got one of the biggest military establishments in history.
And just to talk a little bit about Thomas Ricks here, he's very critical of different, I think General Franks, I guess we could say, is very critical of news assessing whatever, and whether it's right or wrong. It seems to me I mentioned the word opaque, but there doesn't seem to be an extraordinary amount of discussion about the ways that commanders are good or bad. It's rare to have a commander removed, and that could be a substantial problem. The one person you could think of is General McChrystal, who was removed, referable to a Rolling Stones article. And of course, Rolling Stones has its issues these days. But that seems to be, it wasn't so much his performance, but the fact this appeared in public and it was critical of the president, which is reasonable to take.
Similar to MacArthur, once again, for the reason he was removed. Well, there are a couple of ways to look at that. One way I would look at that is that the military is a profession. It is not supposed to be politicized, at least not in the macro sense.
Yes.
In which we vote for our generals, and I know that some
well, we used to.
have.
Did we used to? Did we not? Is that the way Abraham Lincoln, I think, became a company commander of the Black Hawk War? He was voted in. You know, he used to vote.
But not
in the Civil War, I think the people started out, they're locally raised, but that's not the case.
But at the end,
you can't do that.
At that size and that scale, it doesn't work. So at one level, there's no real reason for us to know what goes on any more than I should know how the medical
Yes,
profession
right.
governs itself. On the other hand, given civilian control, we are the bosses of the military.
Yes.
That the military is under restraints in a democratic system that it absolutely is not in, for instance,
Right,
North
right,
Korea.
right.
That you have got, as a general, you've got to be mindful of what is
Right,
going on in
right.
the voting booth, if only because your boss, the president, is telling you to be
Yes.
mindful of it.
Well, now is a general? I mean, the way what I'm sort of getting into a little bit is the way generals are trained. Their story is so complicated. The world is so complicated. Maybe they almost need a PhD in sociology, or I mean, when you're in these complicated situation in an alien country with all sorts of strange customs, and they're being put there to project American power. And maybe some very substantial political error has been made when they've been put there.
Yes.
And does the military have the resources, the ability to say this mission is not an acceptable mission, don't do this? Any comments about it? Interchange going back and forth?
Well, if there isn't, there should be. And generals and admirals as well often do have a big diplomatic role. Especially in the Navy, the old Navy prior to the 20th century, when you don't have radio communications.
Yes, right.
There was a very big diplomatic aspect to it. A lot of times you will see, I believe it was Ray Spruance who became governor of the Philippines for
Yes.
a while after the war, and if it wasn't Spruance, it was someone else.
Yes.
The question is, do you have a president who will listen to good advice from people who know their jobs better than he knows their jobs? And that's luck of the draw. So.
Well, we could go into that discussion. I mean, so we have this military that's powerful. It can do all these things. It has this complicated role that's been put out there to perform. In general, I would say the people go. They're very. I mean, I've had a little time and whatever. I would say the reserves, the National Guard. I don't pass myself off as having any extraordinary experience. But the idea is that the culture it has its definite culture. It's a 1, 2, 3 kind of place.
Yes.
You know, the mess hall is open at 7 o'clock. It closes at whatever. You shine your shoes, the whatever it is, salute the flag. It's very regimented, and then putting that system into a chaotic, crazy arrangement. It's a very difficult thing to do, and it depends on the politician knowing what the military can and cannot do. And it's very unusual now for politicians to have had experience in the military. We discussed the ideas of generals, but junior officers is another matter, or enlisted men as far as that goes.
And that's
Comments?
a problem. We have a much smaller percentage of people having served in the military now than really any time since the Second World War.
Yes.
And yes, we have very rarely elected career officers. Eisenhower is probably the best example. Ulysses S. Grant would be another good example. Maybe Andrew Jackson.
Maybe George Washington.
Maybe, sort of, kind of, but that's about it. On the other hand, and once again, especially in the wake of the Civil War and since World War II, most presidents have had some sort of military experience. So I think they were well placed to appreciate the military culture and the complexity of military missions without thinking they were experts in it. And when you get people with absolutely no military background whatsoever, and perhaps even taking Bill Clinton as an example, a disdain for the military born of the war protesting phase, that can be a big problem. So.
Well, maybe I could mention the Cuban Missile Crisis. So which is a fascinating kind of event that just about expunged our species from the planet. One could say that it's just an extraordinary turn of events.
Yes.
And the job that President Kennedy did under those circumstances and the way that finally worked out, what a great story that was. It's really quite a drama. And if one goes into the story, the Joint Chiefs were recommending to like just send the troops into Cuba, let's do that, let's blow those guys up. I mean, not totally, but that was the thrust of what they were saying. President Kennedy was responding to that by, these guys were saying this and that to him, but he had been a junior officer in the South Pacific.
Yes.
And I think he knew the way this deal went in a lot. So he was a little bit suspicious of what's going on. Plus, I guess he'd had the Bay of Pigs event. But having that background is a very useful thing in these great national decisions.
Yes.
And then one other comment to make about that is that the there was the idea, the military idea at that point was, we've got, we see where their soldiers are, we see where we know we can blow those soldiers up or whatever, but all of the political complexities that were out there, all of those things sort of escaped them. And they were focusing on their sort of their mission, the mission is take those guys out down there.
Yes.
Whether they have nuclear weapons, the chances of nuclear weapons, the mathematical possibilities of that, never entered the equation. No one's just saying, well, look, these decisions are very complicated. Any comments?
Oh yes, several. Well, I am certainly no Kennedy apologist. I have a very dim view of the Kennedys in general. I would also say that if Kennedy hadn't botched Bay of Pigs, that we might not have had a Cuban Missile Crisis. That being said, I would encourage everybody to go see the movie 13 Days. It's a little bit too pro-Kennedy, but it's a gripping movie, very well done. And I agree especially with your later statement that they were focused in on the military side, because in my experience, it's the military who is less willing to turn to force as a first resort, because they have seen war, they know what it costs. They know the human costs of war. It is the commander-in-chief with no military experience whatsoever who tends to be more cavalier about, let's throw a couple of brigades at them and see what happens. But Kennedy in that case was tempering military solution with diplomacy. There's a wonderful scene in 13 Days when Secretary of Defense McNamara is telling an admiral, this is not a military confrontation. This is Khrushchev and the president talking to each other in a new language.
Yes.
And this is something military guys are not getting. And I think there's a valid point to be made there. So.
I wonder about general craft. I mean, so they just use the word. You're going through the training you receive, the idea that you have to think very broadly. And I understand there are efforts underway to do that, but is there any way to grade? So what I'm getting at is, I keep going back to the word opaque. Is there some kind of external mechanism to sort of see how well the system is working, to see how well the officer corps is doing, because it's sort of a self-regulated kind of arrangement.
Yes.
And at least Mr. Ricks here is very critical of some of the generalship that occurred, saying, well, Osama bin Laden escaped in Afghanistan. We could have had him. These arrows were made. Just sort of a post-incident report that causes an improvement in maybe pulling the person out that is not able to handle the deal, which who can say if you can or not? If you're trained for this your whole career, and you've never really played baseball, you've never really, you've been using the batting machine, and and then you actually have the bat, and then you have the alien pitcher. It's quite a jump, isn't it?
Yes. Well, train like you fight and fight like you train. The idea is that you try to make the training as much like the real thing as possible, so you will have been tested.
Yes.
But there is nothing like real combat, and there's no way to tell who's going to be good at it and who's not going to be good at it. And you can be good at a lower level, and then as you move up higher and have to delegate more, maybe you're not as good. But who else is there? Who's going to tell you whether or not you're a good brain surgeon or not?
Yeah, just so. I mean, that's a good point.
I mean, you could get other generals to do it, but the problem there is that unfortunately some generals do become prima donnas. I mean, once again, look at MacArthur, and they become very envious of each other, and may not, their critiques may not be based on the best of motives. And if you get inter-service, it gets even worse, because there's always the fear that, well, if I'm a Marine general, that these Navy pukes are going to stay too far away from the shore and get a lot of my men killed, because they're my men and the Navy pukes don't care about them.
Yes.
So, at some point you got to trust somebody.
Okay, now we've talked, I'm going to just mention a word, I hope I get this correctly in German, the Clausewitz. I guess I came close to that.
Clausewitz,
who is this great Prussian general staff guy, and around 1830 or so wrote on war and
Von Kriege.
On the war, the Kriege. Yes, I hope you'd read that, maybe the original German. I don't, but the idea that that war is just sort of it's sort of a form of politics. The idea that you have a political mission to accomplish, whatever your political objective is, and that you're going to use your military to accomplish it. It's not it's not the war itself, but it is the political events that you're trying to accomplish. Sort of like your reference to, I guess, the movie 13 Days,
Yes.
the idea of language. This has nothing to do with war. It's what Kennedy and Khrushchev are going to sort of do with the world.
Yes.
And so this is kind of they're in an arm wrestling match, and how that can be resolved. That's the story, not so much whether we blow your ship up or not.
Right, right. Yes, and the most famous line from Clausewitz, and people who know nothing else about Clausewitz know this line, that war is an extension of politics
Yes.
by other means. But that sentence itself has been a subject of huge debate among military
Yes,
theorists.
right,
And
right.
how do you translate it? What
Right.
does he mean? Is it true? Generally speaking, most militaries start with that today,
Yes.
that war is the use of organized violence to further state policy,
Yes.
to further the policy
Right.
of the state. Others say that no, war is deeper and more fundamentally irrational than
Yes,
that.
right.
John Keegan, who is a great
Right,
military
right,
historian of the late 20th century, says that that's what Clausewitz would like war to be, but it really isn't. You find these irrational, primitive wars when whole civilizations wipe
Yeah, right,
themselves
right,
out
yes,
for no
yes,
reason.
Yes, yes.
But yeah, that's really the starting point that most modern militaries proceed from.
Now, getting into that, so now we can maybe discuss what the United States national policy is, whatever
Yes.
it is, and then what we're using our military for. And so I guess what we'd like is we'd like world peace. We'd like the Islamists to stop blowing people up. We'd want them to be peaceful, nice. And there are many nice Islamic people. So that's what we like. We like people to be nice and then not bother anybody else. But when we use the idea of using force, and actually to some degree limited force,
Yes.
I mean, is that the real way? Is that the way things are being accomplished? And do we blame the military if it doesn't happen? So you could say, well, the military lost whatever they lost Vietnam, the military lost Iraq, the military's lost whatever they're saying. But actually, it was using incorrect use of military force to obtain a state policy that should have been obtained in a more balanced way. And thus, when we confront ISIS in Syria, is that the way to do it? Are we in Afghanistan? Was that a good use of all our treasure and resources? What were we really up to
Yes,
there?
probably not.
What were we doing in Afghanistan? What was all that about?
State building.
Was that
State
what it
building.
was?
Well, that's
I
what
mean,
some people say. but-
Apparently, we spent many people were injured, killed.
Yes.
We spent trillions of dollars, and I think we went in there initially to get Osama bin Laden,
Yes.
unsuccessfully.
Yes.
He left the country. We stayed there, and for some reason just sort of I won't get past that. We just stayed there for a long time. We're still there. The place is
Well,
unstable.
We're getting out now. but-
Well, that's right. But
Formally.
it was like some extraordinary period of time. What
Yes.
was all that about? And so that would seem to be some kind of substantial failure of not military policy, but government policy. And then looking at the same situation in Iraq, what was all that about?
Yes.
So,
State building again.
well, I mean, so there are trillions of dollars
Oh,
on and on. The American people say we have to do this because of there's nuclear weapons there, whatever. Okay, we blew the place up, we went in, and then what are we going to do now?
Yes.
What's the deal now? There are no nuclear weapons. We've overthrown a bad guy, but this system is so complicated. That is such a cockpit of just hell. It's very difficult to insert American power in there, to use the American military to do that. So have eras have taken place, and is it been wise for America not to militarily confront ISIS? I mean, you have any thoughts about that?
Oh, there's several different problems there. First of all, there are some things the military simply cannot do. And if you ask the military, they will tell you, if you order us in, we'll go, but this is not our mission. We're not going to be any good at it. That state building, that preserving peace. I mean, the military is not principally designed as a peacekeeping force. It is designed, once again, to use organized violence to further state policy by destroying the enemy force.
Yes.
And also limited war. And limited war, it's limited for a lot of reasons. It's limited because you don't want to pay for bigger war.
Yes.
It's limited because you don't have the soldiers and The politicians cannot countenance a draft because they'd be voted
Yes,
out.
yes.
It's limited because since World War II of the fear of escalation into nuclear exchanges.
Yes.
So, but it makes the American people very frustrated because American people we're straight shooting. If we go to war, we go to war because of its, against great moral evils.
Yes, right.
And how do you fight a great moral evil in a limited way? It's
Yes.
oxymoronic.
And also to make this point, I mean, if we get it, well, I would say maybe the greatest war in my lifetime was the first Gulf War, when we just absolutely, the military did what it was supposed to
Yes.
do. It had these tanks in the desert.
Yes.
It's like here the bad guys are. There's no question about it. They're in the tanks. Here's your tank. Here's your weapon. That's your weapon. It's chess that they can play. They did a great job. But then, just to make this comment, is that putting the military in that situation where the idea is these people that don't look like us, they're bad guys or whatever, and we're in this situation, inevitably something that approaching war crimes appear. It's
Yes.
almost impossible to prevent that. So all these occasional atrocities occur. There are Abu Ghraib prison issues, and so the command control gets very difficult in that set of
Yes,
circumstances. And is that anticipated and thought about by politicians or the military at all? In other
It
words,
is
let's
supposed
say
to be,
we're
yes.
going to go in, name your target. We're going into Cuba,
Yes.
and we're going to put an occupation army there. Isn't it inevitable that some bad events are going to take place?
Oh yes, and for a couple reasons. I mean that privates and the lower ranks, every one of them is an ambassador of America, and they're going to cut up, they're going to do stuff. I've talked to non-coms who fed pork rinds to people in Afghanistan.
Right,
Boy,
right.
this is really good, and then they say, oh well, you're eating pork, and
Right.
yeah, that causes international incidents, but,
Sure.
but you can't police every soldier like that. But yes, generals should know this. Even any officer.
Well, do
should
the
know
politicians know
that. The
that?
politicians should know it too. That one of the things that Clausewitz points out is that when you let the dogs off the leash, you'd better be darn certain you want to do it, because you lose control.
Yes.
You cannot control everything, and stuff is going to happen. So, when you say go get them,
Yes.
then
yes.
in a large measure you have turned control of the situation over to the fates.
Yes. And I mean, it's such the extremity of human circumstances in wartime. All sorts of, passions arise.
Yes.
And we've had these terrible stains on national honor, the massacre in Vietnam, My Lai, whatever.
68. Yeah.
And apparently one of the things that transpired there was this enormous amount of cover-up.
Yes.
There's these atrocities were awful. I mean, they were just barbaric.
Yes.
Something you'd imagine the Nazis doing, and yet these were American soldiers, our kith and kin there,
Yes.
representing the country,
And it was our failure, and I think it was the senior commander's failure to understand that when you're in a jungle environment and you're dealing with small units and you've got very junior officers in command of young guys who are in their teens and early 20s, once again, you've lost control of it. And bad stuff's going to happen. You're hormone driven. You see your buddy killed. You become
Yes,
enraged.
sure.
You go hose down of it. It's going to happen. It's the nature of war. I mean, Sherman said it best: war is hell.
so the best thing to do is avoid war. Do we agree with that?
Yes. Wouldn't it be great if we threw a war nobody
Well,
came?
now finally we're getting near our conversation, the end of our conversation. I mean, is there some way out of this conflict in the Middle East that force can be minimized? Do you have any? That's a little softball for you. That's an easy question. Is there any way that we don't need petroleum as much as we used to? There's not as much economic. Any comments?
Well, I was saying on the eve of the Gulf War, if we come home and pour all of our money into development of alternative resources, but at this point we have engendered so much hate over there that I think it would follow us back over. The world is just getting to be a smaller and smaller place all the time, and we're a media empire. And
What about pay? What I'm
making
making this is a slightly facetious comment here, but what about paying people off? Now, I mean, I'm not totally joking. If you're in a situation, I believe that happened pretty successfully in Iraq and
Yes.
out in the western provinces there. People are trying to. The idea is, this is the culture we have here. I'll tell you what, you can send your soldiers in and blow everybody up, but we'll be good if you, give this. It sounds fairly corrupt, doesn't it?
Goes
But
back
I
to
mean-
Tripoli, the Barbary pirates.
Right. I mean, we just asking the question about what's the best kind of statecraft there, and I mean maybe if maybe all alternatives should at least be considered. And about paying people off, there are lots of ways to do that. I mean, maybe you could invite somebody to the White House. Maybe that's the way to do it a little bit. Or if you take the point, or
I see a couple of problems. Number one, are our pockets that deep? Number two, when you're dealing with the most violent ideological factions, they're not going to be easily paid off because it goes beyond money for them. Finally, I'll refer to our conversation in our previous episode that you do that writ large. The best way of ensuring stability and peace is to bring the tide in and raise the boats. Get a middle class that's all over the world that has a decent standard of living. Because when you've got a color TV and a nice sofa to eat a good supper on while you watch it, you're going to be less in the grip of ideology.
well, let me just keep at it a little bit. I'm getting near the end here, but maybe the thing to do is to, not necessarily give people bribes, but you could say we're going to drop the tariffs for your country, or we're going to get an aid policy. We're going to put fresh water from the sea into your country. I mean, something like that. Well, okay, Bucky, another illuminating conversation.
Thank you, sir.
Nice to have you with us tonight.
Indeed.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.